maybe up to half of the students who drop from the university prematurely before graduation and don't transfer to another university do so because of alcohol-related problems. This doesn't necessarily suggest that, but we've got a lot more research to be. We're doing a definitive study of that right now. I think it's a very interesting understudied question. Yes?
You talked about the correlates between family history of alcoholism and frequency of binge drinking. Have you done anything on the other end, like outgoing students who graduate, what's their incidence of developing alcoholism?
See, most of the students who develop alcoholism do so after they've graduated. Fortunately, most of the students who abuse alcohol during the time they're in college stop abusing it once they get into the real world. They have to work for a living and have a family and stuff. So the rates of alcoholism really don't begin to climb, even though probably half the males in the sample meet criteria for alcohol abuse or alcohol dependence. Once they leave the university, most of that disappears. So it's only really after they've graduated and been out for a while that those data can be seen. Yeah.
I know you stated that the problem in that was really greater than the problem for women because of the number of kids.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you looked at the blood alcohol content.
We did not look at the blood alcohol content, but judging from the drinks consumed, I think there's no question that the blood alcohol content was substantially higher when men drank. We didn't look at it, but I mean, it would have to be given the huge difference in numbers when the drinks consumed. Now, let's look at consequences by gender. This is an interesting figure. It shows that in 3, 6, 9, 12 of these instances where there's a significant difference, the males report higher consequences or more often endorse the experience of these consequences than the females. That's not surprising, given that males drink a lot more, and given that the amount that one drinks is crucially important in determining the likelihood that you will experience a consequence. But it's interesting to look at some of some surprising things. Men report 41.9% of the males, 30.7% of the females report engaging in unplanned sexual activity involving alcohol. You would have thought perhaps it might have been the other way around. But there's some pretty dramatic differences. Men are much more likely to be arrested. Men are much more likely, men who are drinking, to be get into trouble with campus or local police. Men are much more likely to have inpatient substance abuse treatment. And if you look at damaged property, that maybe describes it better than anything. 45.5% of the males, only 6.9% of the females. Because of alcohol, there's a truism in our business that men who abuse alcohol hurt others, women hurt themselves. And I think this kind of epitomizes that. So, yes?
Do you have a graph that shows the same statistics controlling for amount of consumption?
This is controlling for,
Amount of consumption.
well, we know that, I have not done that analysis, but we know that men drink more than twice as much as women.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how many of those disappear when you control, how many of them actually stay significant.
My guess is that it is very much dependent on, my assumption is, very much dependent on amount of alcohol consumed. Yeah, absolutely. Let's look at consequences by age. Again, only 3 differences. They're not very different. So basically, the younger students and the older students get into just about as much trouble. as a function of alcohol. Now, depending on your point of view, that's either good or bad, but what it does suggest is that the age factor in Iowa City doesn't make a difference in the consequences, just as it didn't make a difference in amount of alcohol consumed. Family history, again, not much of an impact. 2 or 3 of the consequences endorsed more by family history, 2 by family history positive, 1 by family history negative. Not much difference. Greek status made a little more difference, but not a lot. I mean, if you're not pro-Greek and you see this and you find that Greeks were very much more likely to forget where they were or what they did when they were drinking than non-Greeks, that would give you some more ammunition to continue your anti-Greek view. Okay, let me try to sum up what I've said. I think that in trying to understand the extraordinarily heavy drinking and the very high prevalence of binge drinking and frequent binge drinking at the University of Iowa, and the correspondingly high self-reports of consequences as a function of drinking, one takes into account the fact that the University of Iowa meets the 3 Wechsler criteria. It's in the north central part of the country, it's a residential campus, and there are 56 bars and taverns within not a mile, but in some cases 100 yards of the residence halls. But almost certainly those factors alone don't account for the fact that students at the University of Iowa are clearly at the very top of the list of binge drinkers in American colleges and universities. The local option is clearly an important factor here. It permits underage drinkers to go into the bars and taverns. It increases access. And access is well recognized by professionals in my field to be perhaps the most important single determinant of the quantity and frequency of drinking by most groups in the population. If it's convenient to do, if it's close to where you live, if it's inexpensive, and if your friends are all doing it too, you're going to be much more likely to drink, and in this case, to drink abusively. And this under 21 option makes the access available to all. Access is virtually unlimited in Iowa City, and I think many of you know that. So that's a big part of the problem. There's one other issue that we're currently trying to understand, and that is, do students who come to the University of Iowa bring their abusive drinking patterns with them, or do they acquire them along with the knowledge of English and calculus during their freshman year? And our assumption is that one of the factors that differentiates these students from perhaps students in other places is that there is a tradition of heavy drinking in high schools in Iowa, often around weekend nights and athletic contests. And we're doing some research on that now, trying to understand just how prior experience with alcohol as high school students, again, normative heavy drinking in high school relates to what becomes normative abusive drinking in college. We think that's an important factor. We've also done some research among parents of our students and find that, and you can ask yourselves whether this is how your parents would respond. When we asked them about how they felt about their students drinking, they said, well, actually, a number of them, significant number said, you know, I'm actually relieved that they're not into drugs. Even when we told them we thought maybe their kids were drinking too much. Alcohol is seen in Iowa, and perhaps more generally in the upper Midwest, as a benign substance. It's only alcohol, it's only beer. And yet you see from the data we showed you that if you think in terms of the consequences of drinking, it's not benign. And in fact, in terms of the frequency of students at the University of Iowa who drink versus those who use drugs, much smaller percent. Alcohol is much more of a public health problem, and the consequences of drinking are much greater than they are from drug use. So, in terms of what to do about such a thing, I'm convinced that access is the first place to start. And those of you responsible for students' peer names, I would suggest that access ought to be where you started too. We are working hard to convince the city council that ultimately the only answer is going to be to withdraw permission for students to go into the bars before they're 21. My guess is that will reduce the quantity and frequency of drinking and the prevalence of consequences by about a third. It will also bankrupt probably a quarter to a third of the owners of the bars and taverns, which will not be a bad thing. We talked about this at lunch. Because of the amount of drinking in Iowa City, bars and taverns have flourished and basically have driven out of downtown Iowa City almost every other business establishment besides bars and taverns. If some of the bars and taverns are unable to make a go of it, and there are some empty stores, I suspect the rents will go down and more of the interesting non-alcohol purveying stores will come back to downtown Iowa City, and that's probably in the best interest of everybody, including the students. Yes.
I was just wondering if you thought that the ordinance that I heard you pass, eliminating drink specials, was a step towards that?
I think it's a step toward that, and there are a couple of other things they're going to do. They're not going to let people order for other people who aren't there, e.g. people who aren't 21. It's a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's going to make a huge impact. My guess is that it's going to have to be this under 21. Yes?
I don't know how it is in Iowa, but is the University of Iowa, like, does everybody know it's a big party school?
Yes.
Is there self-selection?
Yes. I mean, we even had students in the Daily Iowa, the student newspaper, who said, gee, if they limit drink specials, and especially if kids under 21 can't go to the bars, this won't be a party school anymore, and there'll be fewer students that want to come here. That's not exactly what a faculty person wants to read. But yes, I think that's why you came to ISU. You were serious. You want to get a good education. Yes.
Do you know if there's historical data that goes back in terms of binge drinking before the 21, 18 for drinking?
No. The data, it's a good question. The data that we have about the change from 18 to 21 is there was a dramatic decline in deaths and serious accidents among kids 18 to 21, automobile accidents. So increasing the legal limit, the age limit for drinking, decreased the frequency of serious accidents and deaths in automobiles. In other words, it decreased rapid driving. Those are the data that we have. We don't have data on binge drinking. I think the assumption is, based on those drinking and driving data, that when the age was increased, there was a reduction to some extent in some parts of the country in binge drinking. Yes?
Next on all this, but at each time during the survey, did you ask where the students were doing their drinking? If it was in the bar,
estimate that 80 to 85% of the drinking takes place in bars and taverns. It's a hassle to give parties, and students know that if under 21 kids come to their parties and then get into trouble, they're liable. So they'd rather put that on the bar owners. So something between 80 and 85%. Yeah.
This is kind of related to what someone else asked, but is there anything in your research that, I guess I was looking for something that would let people know that there were some consequences after college? Does it seem overwhelmingly from what you've seen that people drop it when they leave college? So over at the counseling center, people aren't concerned about their consequences in college.
People,
They're just like, we're going to quit. when we
it's
leave.
a very good question, and people have wondered for years the relationship between drinking pattern in college and likelihood of developing alcoholism after college. And, F. Scott Fitzgerald and so many other writers drank heavily in college and became alcoholics later on. The truth is there aren't good data to enable this correlation between the two. Fortunately, most males who abuse alcohol in college don't do so after they graduate. Else we'd have much higher rates of alcoholism in the country than we do. So we just don't know how the two relate. What we do know is if you don't drink heavily in college, you're substantially, one, you're unusual, and two, you're unlikely to have a problem later. That's about the most that we know. Yes?
Do you have any sense of what would be the actual or potential impact of alcohol education programs directed at especially entering college students, the idea that drinking may have some hazards?
We do a lot of that.
Do you think it has any impact?
No. Well, what it does is it makes the students better informed in drinking. But it has virtually no impact on behavior. Unfortunately. And every residence hall has required alcohol education courses.
Have there been many reports from campuses that have gone to alcohol-free housing, residence halls in Greece on if that's making a difference?
Well, it reduces access, and that's the key. So my guess is, well, that in fact there have been reports, there's some reduction in drinking because access is but it still doesn't change the fact that abusive drinking is normative in the students. I think I'd better stop, and I thank you very much.